In the mountains of northern Sweden, in remote locations far from major cities, the government is building massive concrete silos. Huge cylindrical towers capable of holding thousands of tons of grain. These are not commercial storage facilities for ordinary trade. These are strategic reserves, food insurance in case of crisis, war, supply chain collapse, or unforeseen catastrophe. Sweden hasn't done anything like this since the Cold War. For decades, the country lived in confidence that global trade would provide food under any circumstances. Why spend money on reserves when you can simply buy grain on the world market? But in 2024 to 2025, the government sharply changed course. $60 million allocated for grain storage construction. The first silos are already being built, especially in the northern regions. But here's what's interesting. What exactly are they storing there? Not corn, although corn is the most produced grain in the world. Not oats, although Sweden traditionally grows oats. Not barley, not rye. Wheat. Almost exclusively wheat. And Sweden is not alone. Norway stores 30,000 tons of wheat. India holds 58 million tons of rice. Indonesia, 4 million tons of rice. China stores reserves of rice and wheat sufficient for an entire year for 1.5 billion people. Practically all countries in the world creating strategic food reserves choose the same thing. Wheat and rice. Why? Why not crop diversity? Why not corn, which dominates world grain production? Why are two specific species chosen again and again, from Scandinavia to Southeast Asia, from democracies to authoritarian regimes? Today I will tell you not about secret conspiracies, because these reserves are completely not secret, they are openly published in budgets and discussed in parliaments. I will tell you about grain biology. About why the structure, chemical composition, and physical properties of grain crops determine which countries will be able to survive a crisis and which will be defenseless. About why some grains can be stored for 30 years without refrigeration, while others spoil in a few months. And about how these properties of plants have determined the fate of empires for millennia. And the first thing to understand: state grain reserves are absolutely not secret. Sweden openly announced a budget of $60 million and published plans for silo construction. Norway officially reported 30,000 tons of wheat in reserves. India publishes monthly reports on rice stocks. This is the work of the State Food Corporation of India, a public organization. China declares its policy of absolute food security at the official level. This is not a conspiracy. This is logistics. But what exactly they store and why exactly this, is a question of pure grain biology. For long-term grain storage, there are three absolute criteria on which everything depends. The first criterion: moisture and grain structure. This is the foundation. Any biological substance spoils due to the activity of microorganisms, bacteria and mold. But these organisms can multiply only in the presence of moisture. If grain moisture drops below a certain threshold, microbiological activity completely stops. The grain enters a state of suspended animation. It can lie for decades without change. Wheat after drying and proper processing contains 10 to 12% moisture. This is a very low level. At such humidity, bacteria cannot multiply, mold spores do not germinate. The grain becomes biologically inert. Under proper storage conditions, dryness, darkness, absence of oxygen, wheat can lie for 20, 30, even 40 years. Archaeologists have found wheat grains in Egyptian tombs thousands of years old, and some of them were still capable of sprouting. Rice is even better. Unpolished brown rice with bran contains 12 to 14% moisture and can be stored for 10 to 20 years. But white polished rice, from which the bran and germ have been removed, contains even less moisture and stores for practically unlimited time. Rice has been found in sunken ships, lying on the seabed for 100 years in sealed containers. It was completely suitable for consumption. Now compare with corn. Corn grain has a completely different structure. It is more starchy, porous, hygroscopic. Even after thorough industrial drying, corn contains 15 to 18% moisture. This is too much. At such humidity, the grain remains vulnerable to mold and bacteria. Corn can be stored for a maximum of 1 to 2 years under ideal conditions. For strategic reserves designed for 10 to 30 years, it is useless. Oats are even more problematic. Oat grain can contain up to 14% moisture, which is already on the edge. But the main problem with oats isn't even this. The second criterion that kills many crops for long-term storage. Fat content. Fats oxidize. This is an inevitable chemical process. When fats contact oxygen in the air, they slowly decompose, become rancid, acquire an unpleasant smell and taste, lose nutritional value, and can even become toxic. Wheat contains only 2 to 3% fats. Rice contains less than 1% fats in white polished form. These are minimal amounts that don't create storage problems. And oats? Oats contain 15 to 20% fats, more than any other grain. These fats are concentrated in the germ and in the outer layers of the grain. And they begin to oxidize within 6 to 12 months after harvest. Oats acquire a characteristic rancid smell, become bitter to taste, nutritional value drops. After 2 years, oats are practically unsuitable for consumption. They are excellent for immediate consumption. Oatmeal is incredibly nutritious and beneficial. But for strategic reserves for decades. A catastrophe. Corn also contains significant amounts of oils in the germ, 4 to 5%, which seems like little, but it's enough. After a year and a half, corn grain begins to smell of rancid fat. Corn oil is a valuable product, but in the context of long-term storage it becomes a problem. The third criterion. Physical grain protection and pest resistance. Even if you've solved the moisture and fat problems, the threat of insects remains. Weevils, grain moths, flour mites, a whole army of pests specializing in eating grain stalks. They can destroy tons of grain in months. Wheat grain is covered with a hard multilayer bran shell. This is a dense, almost woody structure that is difficult to chew through. Inside under the shell is the endosperm, a dense starchy layer. The grain is dry, hard, not very attractive to insects. Yes, pests attack wheat too, but slowly. Rice in husk, unpolished paddy rice, is covered with an incredibly hard siliceous hull. This hull is so hard that it's impossible to chew through by virtually any insect. Rice in husk can lie for decades with almost no damage from pests. Even white polished rice, though more vulnerable, remains hard and dry enough to resist attacks. And corn? Corn grain is soft, sweet, full of starch and sugars that insects love. It's their favorite delicacy. Weevils chew through corn in weeks, reproducing inside grains at a frightening rate. Oats are also soft, easily damaged. The fourth criterion, though less critical. Caloric density and nutritional density. For strategic reserves, it's important to store maximum energy in minimum volume. Wheat provides 340 kilocalories per 100 grams. Contains 13% protein, 70% carbohydrates. This is concentrated energy. From wheat you can make flour, bake bread, cook porridge, prepare pasta, basic calories for survival. Rice provides 365 kilocalories per 100 grams. Almost pure carbohydrate, 80%. Minimum protein, but maximum energy. Corn provides 365 kilocalories, comparable. But all its energy advantages are negated by the impossibility of long storage. So when you add all the criteria together, low moisture, minimum fats, hard protective shell, pest resistance, high caloric density, only 2 winners remain. Wheat and rice. Everything else is filtered out at some stage. And this is not a modern discovery. This is knowledge that humanity has accumulated over millennia through observation and experience. Remember the biblical story of Joseph in Egypt. 7 years of abundance, 7 years of drought and crop failures. Pharaoh, warned by Joseph, orders grain to be stored in the years of abundance. What did they store? Wheat. Egypt was the granary of the ancient world, exported wheat throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeologists have discovered remains of massive state granaries 4,000 years old, huge clay silos capable of holding hundreds of tons of grain. Why wheat? Because the Egyptians knew at the level of experience passed through generations. Wheat doesn't spoil. It can be stored for years, it will save people in hungry times. The Roman Empire created one of the most complex food logistics systems in the ancient world, the annona, state grain supply. Rome, with a population of more than 1 million people, depended on constant grain deliveries. The state kept strategic wheat reserves for 3 to 6 months for the entire capital population. They imported from Egypt, North Africa, Sicily. Stored in massive warehouses, Horia, built throughout the city. And again, wheat. Because it stored well, didn't require complex processing, could feed millions. When empires collapsed due to grain supply interruptions, these were not abstract economic crises. This was grain biology in action. The inability to stockpile enough storage-stable food meant civilization's vulnerability. In the 20th century, during the Cold War, the USSR and Western countries kept strategic grain reserves in case of nuclear war. The Soviet Union stored wheat and rye. Rye also stores fairly well, 5 to 10 years, though inferior to wheat. Reserves were distributed throughout the country in secret and not-so-secret storage facilities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this system was largely liquidated. For decades, European countries lived without strategic reserves, relying on global trade. And now, in the 2020s, everything is changing again. Sweden is reviving the grain reserve system for the first time in decades. $16 million allocated for silo construction, especially in the northern regions of the country. Why the north? Because the northern regions of Sweden, Norrbotten, Västerbotten, depend on long supply chains from the south of the country and from abroad. In winter, roads can be blocked by snow. In a crisis, war, energy collapse, logistics failure, these regions could be cut off from food for weeks or months. Local grain production is insufficient due to the short growing season and cold climate. What do they store? Wheat. Why? Because it can be stored for 20 to 30 years without complex equipment, just dry sealed silos. Because from wheat you can grind flour and bake bread in local bakeries, basic survival is ensured. Because wheat doesn't go rancid, doesn't spoil, doesn't require refrigerators that depend on electricity. Norway is following the same path. 30,000 tons of wheat in strategic reserves. These are the first reserves since the Cold War. They use a rotation system. Every year they buy fresh grain, sell old grain to farmers and mills at market prices. This way reserves remain always fresh, but there's still a strategic buffer in case of crisis. India holds 58 million tons of rice in state reserves. These are the world's largest grain stocks. But this is not a military secret, this is the work of the Food Corporation of India, a public organization that manages procurement, storage, and grain distribution. Why such huge reserves? First, to stabilize prices. When the harvest is poor, the state releases grain onto the market, preventing prices from skyrocketing. Second, for food aid programs, about 800 million Indians receive subsidized rice and wheat through the state distribution system. Why rice? Because rice is the dietary staple for most of India's population. Because India is the world's largest rice exporter, produces huge volumes. And because rice stores for decades without problems. Indonesia stores for million tons of rice. China officially states that strategic reserves of rice and wheat are sufficient for a year for the entire population, 1.5 billion people. This is not a national security secret, this is public policy of absolute food security, proclaimed at the highest level. The pattern is obvious. Almost everyone chooses wheat or rice. Or both at once, depending on what forms the basis of the national diet. But there's one country that's going a radically different route. Germany is reconsidering the entire concept of strategic reserves. The Minister of Defense proposed a revolutionary approach. Store not grain, but ready-to-eat canned products. Canned ravioli, canned meat, canned vegetables. The logic is this. In a real crisis, war, natural disaster, infrastructure collapse, people won't have time, equipment, or energy to grind grain into flour, knead dough, bake bread. Electricity may be cut off. Gas unavailable. Bakeries destroyed. People need food that can be opened and eaten immediately, without processing. $105 million allocated for the program to create such reserves. But instead of building state warehouses, Germany is transferring responsibility to private retailers, supermarkets and food chains. They store canned goods in their regular warehouses, sell them as part of regular trade, but are required to maintain a certain minimum volume of stocks. Rotation happens automatically, old canned goods are sold, new ones are purchased. This is a controversial approach. Canned goods store for 3 to 5 years, not 30 like wheat. They take up more volume per calorie unit. They are more expensive. But they are ready for immediate consumption. Germany is betting on convenience and immediate availability versus longevity. Will time show this is correct? Unknown. But the fact remains. Everyone else chooses grain. And now let's answer the question that should torment any attentive observer. Why not corn? Corn is the most produced grain crop in the world. More than 1 billion tons annually. It dominates agriculture in the USA, Brazil, Argentina, China. Why is it practically absent from strategic reserves? The answer is now obvious. Corn doesn't store. 15 to 18% moisture makes it vulnerable to mold. 4 to 5% fats in the germ go rancid in a year and a half. The soft grain structure makes it easy prey for insect pests. Corn is excellent for immediate consumption, for feeding livestock, for ethanol production. But for strategic reserves designed for 10 to 30 years of storage, it's useless. You cannot rely on corn in the long term. Why not oats? Oats contain 15 to 20% fats, a record among grains. After 6 to 12 months, these fats oxidize, the grain goes rancid, becomes bitter and unsuitable. Oatmeal is a fantastic product for daily consumption, incredibly healthy, nutritious. But for reserves for decades, a catastrophe. Why not rye? Rye stores fairly well, 5 to 10 years, sometimes more. It was traditionally used in Northern and Eastern Europe. The USSR stored rye alongside wheat. But rye yields less than wheat under modern conditions. Rye bread is denser, heavier, less caloric per unit volume. In an era when wheat is available everywhere, rye loses the competition on all parameters. Why not buckwheat, quinoa, amaranth, and other alternative pseudo-grains? They actually store well, low moisture, minimum fats. But their production is negligible compared to wheat and rice. To create strategic reserves, you need crops that are produced in millions of tons, available on world markets, have established infrastructure for storage and processing. Wheat and rice dominate globally, they are what's chosen. 2 winners. 2 champions of longevity. Wheat is the absolute champion in storage duration among all grains. Under proper conditions, moisture below 12%, sealed packaging or silos, protection from light and oxygen, wheat stores for 30, 40, 50 years. Wheat grains have been found in ancient Egyptian pyramids, in sealed vessels, thousands of years old. And this grain was still capable of sprouting, though it lay for millennia. This is not magic. This is biology. Low moisture stops microbial activity. Minimum fats prevent oxidation. The dense bran shell protects from oxygen and pests. Wheat enters a state of biological pores and can remain in it for decades. Rice is the eternal grain. White polished rice, from which bran, germ, and all fat-containing parts have been removed, stores for practically unlimited time. 100 years, 200 years, if conditions are right, rice doesn't spoil. Bran rice with bran stores 10 to 20 years, slightly less due to small fat content in the bran, but still impressive. Rice is so stable that it was used as currency in some Asian cultures. A sack of rice could be passed from generation to generation as inheritance, retaining value for decades. That's why wheat and rice. That's why governments from Scandinavia to Southeast Asia make the same choice again and again. This is not a political decision. This is not a cultural preference. This is cold biological logic. Grain structure, chemical composition, physical properties determine what can be stored for decades and what will spoil in months. State grain reserves are not secrets and not conspiracies, as one might think from a clickbait headline. Sweden openly publishes its plans. Norway reports tonnage. India maintains public statistics. China declares its policy on the international stage. This is ordinary, rational preparation for crises, based on lessons of history. Empires collapsed due to grain supply interruptions. Cities starved when reserves were exhausted. People survived because they learned to stockpile the right crops, those that don't spoil, that can lie for years and still feed people. And the choice of these crops is determined not by humans, but by nature. Plant properties that evolved over millions of years determine human civilization. Wheat and rice won not because someone decided this at the political level, but because their biology, grain moisture, fat content, shell structure, makes them ideal for storage for decades. This is a lesson about how tiny differences in plant structure have huge consequences for societies. This is a lesson that some things don't depend on technology, politics, economics. They depend on fundamental biology, chemistry, physics. In a world of growing instability, climate change, geopolitical tensions, supply chain unpredictability, these ancient lessons are becoming relevant again. Countries are returning to what their ancestors knew for millennia. Stockpile grain that doesn't spoil, and you'll survive the crisis. Wheat and rice. Two grains that fed empires. Two grains that saved peoples in hungry times. Two grains on which humanity relies again when the future becomes uncertain. Sometimes the most important decisions are made not by humans, but by the very nature of plants. Do you store grain at home for long-term storage? Which crops do you choose? Have you noticed the difference in how long they remain suitable? Have you tried storing wheat, rice, oats, or corn and observed what happens after 1, 2, 5 years? Share your experience in the comments. Let's learn from nature and from each other's experience.